In this chapter, the text attempts to present some alternatives to the points of view of macroeconomic theory. Unfortunately, the models presented utilize the ADAS model discussed in Chapter 18, so we'll have to take all of this with a big grain of salt and see where it takes us. When the text talks about the causes of macro instability, the author's opinion about what's the strongest case is presented as the mainstream view, while the contrasting point of view, the monetarist point of view, is given a fair amount of discussion, but the language the author uses clearly demonstrates their distaste for this alternative. To sum it up in a nutshell, the text's authors generally support the Keynesian or mainstream perspective that believes that the government's active participation in the economy is what generates long-term stability, while the monetarist point of view is that the government's intervention is the problem, and that if competitive markets can operate freely, then they will eventually produce the long-term stability we're looking for. I suspect the answer lies somewhere in the middle of those 2 points of view. The third point of view presented in the text is the real business cycle view. These economists feel that significant changes in the macroeconomy are generally caused by changes in the resource market and changes in technology rather than the monetary policies of the government or pure competition factors. I tend to lean towards this point of view, even though it puts me in a minority of economists. My reasoning for this is as follows. Fiat currency, i.e., money, holds value if people choose to believe it holds value. Therefore, it makes no difference how much currency the government or banks flood into the money supply. If people choose to not accept it as a means of exchange, medium of account, and store of value, then it holds no long-run value. True economic value exists within the productive resources of a society. If what the economy produces is valuable to the people within it, then the people will be willing to exchange their resources in order to obtain it. New technology is constantly changing the rules of exchange by refining what is valuable to society. For example, there have been some promising advances in the technology of free energy that uses the Earth's own magnetic field to produce 100% clean and abundant energy. Should this technology become widely available to the public, there would no longer be a market for all other forms of energy, including oil, solar, and wind. Further, with energy being essentially free, it would free up resources within the macro economy for even greater productive efficiency in all other areas. I would argue that mainstream and monetarists alike are more concerned with maintaining the short-run status quo rather than allowing innovations in technology to refine resource allocation and production possibilities. They would look upon the idea of free energy technology with horror because if consumers are no longer paying for energy, it would destabilize the oil, gas, and power distribution industries, which would then destabilize the banking industry, which will then destabilize Wall Street. Therefore, even though such technological innovation would generate long-run expansion to the production possibilities curve, because such innovation would cause short-run instability, mainstream and monetarists will do everything in their power to stop such innovation. The fourth and final point of view presented in the text is the so-called coordination failure approach, where economists view the underlying causes of economic instability being a lack of balance in both supply and demand. This is fueled by the expectations of the actors within the economy, which then become a self-fulfilling prophecy of economic disaster. These economists would then work on adjusting public expectations through the media, which would then promote stability in the overall macro economy. Under this scenario, when economic planners seek a desired outcome in the macroeconomy, rather than injecting more cash or investing in public goods, they instead engage in a public relations or propaganda campaign in order to adjust expectations of consumers to the point where their long run goals get met. For example, just as companies are able to create demand for their products via advertising, the government can encourage either spending or saving behavior through direct or subliminal messaging through media. If you're seeing more advertisements for new cars, economic planners are encouraging more capital purchases. If you're seeing more advertisements for opening up savings accounts and wealth management, economic planners are trying to rein in inflation by encouraging saving behavior. Next, the text discusses the philosophy of economic self-correction, which directly challenges the very notion of direct intervention within the macroeconomy by the Fed and the government. If we hold to the rational expectations theory, or RET, you believe that people generally prepare for negative shocks within the macroeconomy by rationally evaluating the available data and then adjusting their expectations accordingly. I have a problem with this rational expectations theory because, one, people's actions are fueled by emotions, and emotions are never rational. And two, most of the economic data presented in the mainstream media is designed to manipulate people through fear of scarcity. And so, how can anybody be rational if they're being lied to? One of the tenets of RET is the efficiency wage theory. Simply stated, the theory suggests that if you pay workers a decent wage, they will be happier and more productive. More productive workers require less supervision and they're less likely to quit. Everybody wins. If this were true, why are employers having such a difficult time hiring workers in the hospitality and fast food industries, despite the fact that wages are nearly at $15 or above per hour? This is especially the case when it comes to the millennial generation, where despite high starting salaries for entry-level positions, these employees tend to leave if they feel as though their work lacks intrinsic value that speaks to their core values. Additionally, there has been a recent surge in entrepreneurship as workers are quitting their comfortable 9 to 5 jobs in favor of building their own businesses, often at a significant cut in pay. And yet these individuals report overall greater job satisfaction and higher work-life balance. Could it be that money isn't the most important thing in the world? The final section of the text is a discussion on the regulatory environment and its impact on the stabilization of the macroeconomy. Generally, I'm in favor of rules and regulations. I've spent a great deal of my professional life in corporate compliance and tax, and I have found that whenever regulation is weak, you are generally going to find individuals taking advantage of those weaknesses. Abuse by one individual usually leads to abuse by many individuals, and abuse by many individuals leads to macro instability. For example, the deregulation of the securities industry led to the emergence of the derivatives market. Monetarists believe that it was the government's expansionary policy from 2001 to 2006 that led to the housing bubble that crashed the economy in 2007. But if there were restrictions in place about what to do with all of that housing debt, then perhaps the risk exposure would not have been so great, as the capital reserve requirements would have limited the size of the housing bubble in the first place. Of course, regulations are completely useless if nobody is willing to enforce them, or if there isn't enough regulators to monitor all of the activity, or if the regulators themselves are corrupt. For example, it is not uncommon to find former government regulators quitting their jobs and then go work for the very industries they were charged with monitoring, usually at 3 to 5 times what they were being paid before. There are rules in place that prevent this type of behavior, but these rules contain so many loopholes that make them effectively useless. The board of the FDA is generally stacked with industry insiders. This is also so at the SEC, the CDC, HSS, Homeland Security, and the list goes on and on. These industry insiders ensure that regulations are written with enough loopholes to exclude their former and future employers, while enforcing regulations that limit competition and funnel the most lucrative government contracts to their friends. The same is true with economic regulation in terms of systemic risk. If a behavior holds an inherent moral hazard, such as lying to one's customers or actively encouraging corruption, then it's up to the government to create and enforce regulations that make such unethical behavior against the law. However, if there aren't any regulations to enforce the government's rule, then it's logical to assume that the immoral and or reckless behavior will persist. And if it happens on a large scale, then it becomes a systemic risk that endangers the entire macroeconomy. Whether rules are successful in the macroeconomic scale is largely in the eyes of the beholder. The list of policy successes on page 401 is rather amusing because almost all of these so-called successes can be traced to rule changes to alter the method of counting rather than actually affecting an actual result. Therefore, the so-called improvement to the economy as a result of government action was more likely the result of propaganda telling us that things got better, which then changed people's economic behavior due to changes in psychology. Wouldn't it be better if we allowed ourselves to evolve economically by allowing for growth and innovation rather than working to maintain the status quo that is bankrupting its citizens, keeping the extremely wealthy whole, and destroying our planet in the process?